everyone. I am at the entrance of the Panama Canal, nearby Panama City, and now I will tell you the story of how this canal was built. It's a very interesting story, so come with me.
Hello everyone, greetings from Panama. So today I will talk about Panama, a country where I have lived most of the time from 2018 to today. So today I will talk about the famous decision of the construction of the Panama Canal in the very early 20th century. I think this is a very interesting story that I will base myself mostly from a very interesting book, which is this one by Juan David Morgan, a Panamanian. So basically these books, which could be translated as With Ardent Glows of Glory, basically it's a novel about the definite separation of Panama from Colombia that allowed the construction of the Panama Canal. So in the next few minutes I will talk a little bit about this very fascinating book that I have just completed reading. And so let's start. So Panama, as we know today, is a rather young country because it only got independent in the beginning of the 20th century. Because before that, Panama was a state of Colombia. Although they tried to be independent a few times, they ended up settling to be just a Colombian state. But as we all know, things would change. So the Isthmus region, a small portion of land that has an approximate 80 kilometers height from Atlantic to Pacific, north and south of Panama. So this region began to attract a lot of interest from some countries. So in the late 19th century, France, through the leadership of an engineer called de Lesseps, designed a plan to construct the canal, but it ended up being not successful because the tropical factors were too hard to overcome, tropical diseases and the complexity itself of the excavations that were needed to create a passage between the oceans. So France gave up, and then right in the beginning of the 20th century, the US, especially through its president, Ted Roosevelt, approached Colombia to design a treaty and the construction of the canal. The trigger for the Panamanian independence idea was related to a confluence of events that were taking place in the beginning of the 20th century. Firstly, Panama was not very happy with the Colombian rulership, claiming that the Bogota government was neglecting some of the Panamanian interests. The book mentions the fact that all the salaries for all the Panamanian soldiers were late for months, so that was causing a lot of discontent in Panama. Secondly, Colombia was just getting out of a very brutal civil war between its liberals and conservatives. So the political climate in Colombia was unstable and very troubled. And perhaps more importantly, the United States was rising as a global player in the beginning of the 20th century, and it had a special interest in Latin America. for geopolitical reasons, but also business-wise, the U.S. liked the idea of constructing a canal between the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, a shorter route that would be very beneficial for them, economically speaking. So the United States, which had a good diplomatic relation with Colombia at the time, proposed a treaty and a construction plan for a canal in Panama, then a Colombian state, right? But as I said, Colombia was going through some shaky political times, and the Colombian Senate ended up rejecting the plan, and which was a surprise because the US was very confident that it could be accepted with perhaps some minor changes, but it could be accepted, but it was rejected by the Colombian Senate. So that was the definite spark for Panama to think very seriously of its independence, because as the book says, the canal was vital for Panama's future, and the idea of losing it because of a Colombian decision would really hurt the prosperity hopes that Panamanians had. It is interesting to mention that the US actually had a plan B for the situation if the plan A, which was Panama, did not work for any reason. So plan B would be through Nicaragua, through the application of a recently passed law called the Spooner Law or Act, after John Spooner, which was a US senator. So the plan was to use Nicaragua if Panama did not work for any reason. So the Panamanians knew that although not very likely, there was a plan B at the table for the US. So this was a strong push so the Panamanians could work quickly on their independence plan. So the Panamanian plan included internal and external aspects. So internally, basically, this conspiracy team had to convince the army and the population in general that it was worth creating their own country. And externally speaking, the conspirators sent Manuel Amador, which gives its name to the very beautiful Amador Causeway here in Panama City today. Amador was sent to the US in September, October 1903 to Washington and New York to construct some relationships that would assure that the US would back up Panama in that independence plan. So according to the book, Manuel Amador's trip to the US was a little bit disappointing, especially in the beginning, because Amador, as well as his comrades back in Panama, were deeply relying on an American lawyer called William Cromwell, who promised that he would get them close to the US State Department and actually as well to the President Roosevelt, right? But that didn't happen. So at one point, Manuel thought about giving up. But then a very strange and interesting character stepped in, which was a French guy called Philippe Bunau Varilla, who was an engineer that actually had financial interest in the French Canal Corporation, right? So he thought about helping the Panamanians because he would gain on the situation. So the Panamanians only had himself, right? Because they had just lost Cromwell. So it was either himself or go back to Panama and perhaps postpone or forget the independence plan. So the Panamanians had to rely on this French character. And it is rather interesting to know that actually a French guy was one of the leaders of the discussions with the US regarding the Panama Canal conditions, right? So, but that was how things played out, and this is one of the reasons why the first treaty for Panama was not as beneficial as it could have been. In October 1903, Manuel Amador took a ship from New York back to Panama, and he was not 100% sure that the US would intervene because he had the word of this strange character, Philippe Bunau Varilla, right? But as soon as Amador came back to Panama, he talked to his team and told them, okay, I am not 100% sure, but the time to act is now. So here I am in Panama City at the Panamanian Pacific coast, in the south of the country, let's say. So here, as well as in the Atlantic coast where Colón sits, the US had to send some Navy ships to make sure that the Colombians would not invade Panama and the conspiracy could work. So the Panamanian conspirators needed to act very quickly because they were afraid that either Colombia would deny their plan in a military way, or the US could have changed its mind and go for plan B, which was Nicaragua. So Panamanians who engineered the coup had to do it very quickly. So in just a few days, the conspirators led by Manuel Amador designed at least a draft of the constitution, designed the ministries of the new country, the army of this new country, some basic rules and regulations, and more importantly, the flag of the country. And I think this is a very interesting story because when Manuel Amador traveled to the US, the French guy that became famous, Philippe Bunau Varilla, actually had an idea for a Panamanian flag, but the Panamanians didn't like the idea because it had like two suns and also some yellow colors on it. So Manuel, and with the help of his allies, but Manuel was a very key designer of the Panamanian flag, which is here. Basically, Manuel's Amador's idea was to unite the blue color from the Conservative Party with the red color from the Liberal Party, and the white would represent the peace. Unfortunately, politics, it's something that it's not very easy to execute in real life, because Amador actually created what he thought would be an unified political party called Constitutional Party of Panama, which would ideally gather both liberals and conservatives. But it turned out that this didn't last long. We know how politics work, unfortunately. So in 1903, November 3rd, Panama City was able to get its independence against Colombia. In the city of Colón, things were a little bit harder, so it took them a few days later to get their independence of the city, because there was a big Colombian army in the city of Colón that ended up giving up, because Panama was able to gather an army of their own, but more importantly, because the U.S., through its Navy ships that were at the Colón Bay, were able to put pressure on the Colombians to surrender, right? So independence was achieved, and the country was considered a new nation at the eyes of the United States and subsequently of other countries of the world. So that's the end of the story. The treaty that came along, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, was not that favorable for Panama. Perhaps the main features of this treaty were: number one, the United States would have the ownership of all the lands from Colón to Panama City, within certain miles of the canal itself. So that gave a great benefit to the United States. And also the concession, right? The use of the canal by the United States at the treaty was considered to be perpetual, meaning that it would never end. So it was only 30 years later, more or less, that Panama was able to break free from the protectorate status it had against the United States, when the Panamanian government renegotiated the terms of the treaty with another Roosevelt, but this time Franklin Roosevelt, which was the nephew of Ted Roosevelt. So things were a little bit more favorable to Panama, but the real freedom of Panama regarding its canal only was achieved in the last day of 1999 or the first day of the year 2000, when the Torrijos-Carter Treaty, signed in 1977, was ratified, saying that once and for all the canal was property of the Panamanian people and Panamanian state, right? So that's how the story unfolded for Panama and its very, very important and symbolic canal that it has. until today. So thanks for your time, and I hope this was entertaining. And what about Colombia? So the book tells that Colombia was so overwhelmed by the loss of Panama. They were caught by surprise because, like I said, they were living under some turbulent political times in the country. So they, on a final desperate attempt, they sent a key politician of the country to the US, and according to the book, what he was going to offer to the US was that this country could have the canal for free, because they really wanted the canal, but of course wanted Panama still under their rulership. But the reality was this was too late, and Panama was able to get its own country, and that's how the story ends.